Hello, this is an interview for Cast in Stone. My name is Dr. Nathaniel Adam Tobias Coleman, and I'm joined by, would you please introduce yourself and your profession and name any associations or groups that you've been part of that are relevant to this interview?
Sure, my name is Cleo Alberta Lake, IE, and I am a Bristolian, and I'm a public and community engagement specialist, artist, and producer and researcher. And I was/am a founding member of Countering Colston, and I'm also the former Lord Mayor of Bristol.
Thank you for joining us, Cleo. I appreciate this. The purpose of the interview is to understand better the contestation of the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol. Please tell me how you came to be interested in the statue of Edward Colston. What brought it to your attention?
I think I was aware of the statue for some time because I attended what was then called Colston's Girls' School. And I do remember after commemoration every year, which was the first Friday of November at the cathedral, some students would walk over to the statue, which is not too far away from the cathedral, really. And I sort of have a memory in my head of people sort of lobbing bronze chrysanthemums, which was the flower we wear for commemoration, which was allegedly Colston's favourite flower, at the statue. However, when that was occurring, I didn't know at the time who Edward Colston was. So I would say it was probably well into my teens. So we're looking at the mid to late 90s, actually, when I sort of realised through being aware of more community activism and things being said from the African Caribbean community about Colston. That was when I was aware of who he was and in some ways what the statue represented. And then it would be in more recent years that I'd had an interest through Countering Colston, really, when we were sort of documenting all of the commemorative aspects of Colston in the city, thinking about the statue and kind of thinking through how problematic it was and that something should be done, inverted commas.
You mentioned African Caribbean perspectives on the statue, the history of contestation from perhaps Black perspectives.
Yeah.
What is that history? What Black voices, specifically Black voices, have been raised in contestation of the statue over the years?
My first memory was the point I just spoke about, and that would have been around 1996. And I can see the people even in my mind of who I saw on a news clip, and very much people who were sort of connected to the St. Paul's area. I know that there was this big Festival of the Sea celebration by the city that didn't acknowledge colonialism or enslavement. I think that was the time when they unveiled a replica of the Matthew ship that was used by John Cabot. So it was around that time when I was becoming aware of these voices. And I do remember as well members of the Rastafarian community. There's a very good film documentary made called Under the Bridge, made by John Sobers and Rob Mitchell, that sort of documents that. It was the African Caribbean and Black, but there are also, of course, other people, as there always has been, involved in sort of challenging the statue and the celebration as well.
What other groups or what other perspectives have been involved in challenging the statue?
I think, well, I would say that there's been quite a lot of interest or desire to challenge by artists over the years. So we are aware of Graham Evelyn Mortimer, who was very close to doing some kind of intervention with the statue. It's got to be at least 15 years ago now. And then I think, well, also Hugh Locke, which is now only a digitally made intervention. So there's been different junctures where artists of African descent have wanted to do an intervention, but we've also had more silent kind of guerrilla counter memorialization, and we don't know who's responsible for that. For example, the kind of sort of guerrilla plaque that was put on the statue itself. So I would say artists have also been involved, and then your sort of other members of Countering Colston, so Bristol Radical History Group, also other community activists. So I think you probably had the interview with Bandelli. If you have, he will also mention the desire of some white British heritage women in around the late 90s, early 2000s, who were just so distressed, and they really wanted to kind of topple the statue.
Do you have any more information on the guerrilla plaque that you mentioned, and this group of persons racialized and gendered as white women who have to topple the statue?
The guerrilla plaque probably appeared around 5 or so years ago, and there's actually still a mark on the plinth, which of course is still there, where you can see where it was stuck on, and it was something along the lines of, it was possibly factually slightly incorrect, but it gave you a strong gist of what Edward Colston was also responsible for. So it kind of quoted, a large figure of Africans who would have been enslaved, and just spoke about the enslavement of Africans. And then the women, again, it was a production that was actually put on at the Arnolfini. I think something connected to Keith Piper's, if I'm right, something to do with Empire. I think it was a touring exhibition. And Bandelli had put together, I believe, a play. I didn't actually see this. This was almost pre my involvement in anything, arts and activism, really. But I heard the stories back, and the women I still know, actually. And they are women who I would say are part of the community, part of the Black community in many ways, and are active in arts and culture and community development to an extent, and are still active today, because this is, obviously over 20 years ago, 20 plus years ago.
Now, for you, who does this statue represent? What did this person do in history, and how did you learn about that?
When I started to understand who Edward Colston was, which was again through my teenage years, really, my late teens, and I don't really recall much in my adult life of really going to the centre that much anyway. It's not necessarily an area I'd go to a lot. Having said that, I think things were heightened when in 1999 I was actually a gallery assistant for the Respectable Trade exhibition at the museum in Bristol, which was the first time Bristol as a city really acknowledged their role in enslaving Africans. And of course there was quite a big focus on Edward Colston. So that was, giving me more awareness. And I think something about the statue itself, obviously sort of remembering it from school days and then going into these periods I've just discussed, it's always kind of struck me though as, of course, a highly problematic figure, someone who was responsible for pain and suffering that endures today and has a modern legacy to it. But I've always kind of been struck as well that the statue, actually, Edward Colston doesn't look happy in that statue.
No.
He looks very troubled. And I think this is probably a bit of an aside, but I think a little more these days about, actually, I can't even find a quote from Colston. I obviously found his will, And I try and think of it in modern terms. It's not really empathizing with him, but it's trying to get an understanding, because even his funeral, which was very grand in the end, it wasn't actually his wish to be that way. So in some ways, it's also the societies and elite society and different organizations, which I would say the statue represented them and their hold in the city more than anything. It's more how they've painted this picture and how they've memorialized someone who possibly didn't really want to be memorialized, although he was quite keen, as I discover in his will, that people who inherited the women, their husbands would go on to take his name, which is quite interesting.
You mentioned how the statue of Edward Colston was erected or conceived. There is a statue nearby, the statue of Colston, and that's the statue of Edmund Burke. It's again in the place that you describe as the centre. What, from your perspective, is the relationship between the statue of Edward Colston and the nearby statue of Edmund Burke?
In some ways, I don't see any connection. I mean, there's a couple more. There's one that's really quite mouldy, and I haven't actually got a clue who that is further down. And again, I think actually the other I think Colston is something that, for whatever reason, because around the plinth, which is still there, you've got the very interesting kind of relief work, the different narratives, which is, you know, quite artistically interesting. It does tell whether they're myths or whatever, but it does tell stories. So that's quite engaging in a way. And there's something about the statue that, you know, aside from the horrors that it also kind of in some ways represented through the person and what they were involved with, there was something that kind of, I don't know, there was a draw. But the other ones, there's nothing that would really draw you in. However, the Edmund Burke, again, something I probably ignored most of my life. I did have a look some years back, because also within the Lord Mayor's parlour, there was a portrait of Edmund Burke as well. Obviously made me want to know, well, who was this guy? And actually, he's got a very nice quote on the front of his plinth. I can't remember offhand, I'd have to kind of Google it, but I know it is a good quote. It is about something like eradicating evil or something, or doing what you can as a politician to, you know, be morally good. I've tried to look into Edmund Burke here and there, and he seems a bit of a kind of on the fence in the middle kind of character. So I think, I mean, we could argue that most people had things that could be good, things that we could deem bad. But it seems like for his period, I know he actually wrote something to do with slavery. I don't know whether it was necessarily positive or negative. But yeah, he's not someone who's ever really been contentious. He's not really anyone who's been discussed at all. I mean, people do say he's the modern maker of conservatism. But then again, it also, sometimes it's about education. It's also about thinking beyond the taglines and perceptions that are thrown at us. Because when I did look into that, I thought, well, you know, as an activism in politics a few years back and Green Party, probably someone to say conservative or thinking about austerity would give me a very negative reaction. But I shouldn't presume that everything conservatism stands for is negative, because I haven't had the chance to look at it in a different perspective. That's a very waffled answer, I know, but I think my takeaway from my research was that it would probably be, say, a conservative, and thinking of people like Edmund Burke, they wouldn't necessarily be against change, but how they would instigate change or work towards it would be far slower and measured than a radical. And that may not always be a bad thing. It's probably not what I would align with, but sometimes I think for things to work, it's good to understand a different perspective. But yeah, the statue doesn't mean much to me, but I think it would be good for people to know more about this character and why he's actually acknowledged so heavily.
Thank you. What do you and do others feel about the statue of Edward Colston? Um,
As it is now,
what emotions did it bring up when it was there? What emotions does the plinth bring up?
the feelings have changed since the statue has gone, because the plinth in that area now is very much a different energy.
Mhm.
And it has an energy of potential, obviously, of change. I did used to have negative emotions about seeing the statue and knowing it was there, but I think it really hit me again when I was Lord Mayor, and I had to, for the first time, not had to, but for the first time I did attend Remembrance Sunday, which I've never attended in my whole life of living in Bristol. It's never appealed to me, but just going there on such a kind of somber occasion, and the cenotaph having been quite recently kind of refurbished, and it was all kind of set up, and it was all sort of facing Colston. It was like Colston was the head of this massive grand remembrance service outside with thousands of people, and it was then I just thought, this just feels so incredibly wrong. That someone who's been involved in pain and suffering and capitalism and architects of racist, whether they were aware of it or not, it doesn't feel right that we're all facing Colston at this moment, or any moment. That's when it really struck me, actually, I would say.
And what year was that?
That would have been 2018.
Now, what have you been doing or trying to do in relation to the statue? You mentioned founding or co-founding an organisation. How was that organisation created or founded? And what is or was your ultimate goal?
The ultimate goal was to disrupt and totally cancel or get rid of the public celebration of Edward Colston. It wasn't wider than Colston, although of course there's so many more people implicated, and institutions. And it came about by, there's been quite a long history of I wouldn't say conspiracy theorists, that's not right, because a lot of what they're researching is fact, but agitators who are just very unhappy with certain aspects of the city and who really runs it, very anti-merchant venturer, and then also, activists, historians in their own right. And it would just happen to be another art intervention in St. Paul's. There was an artist called Labita Clayton, who's actually originally from Cornwall and is dual heritage of Southern African origin. And she was in Bristol for a bit. She'd moved to Bristol, and she was part of a collective called Beef, which was an experimental collective based on Brunswick Square in St. Paul's. And for Black History Month, it must have been, I would say, 2015, I think, she set up a mock pirate radio station called BS2 Resist and Revolt. And she invited myself, Ros Martin, Roger Ball from Ros Martin's an artist. Roger Ball is a leader at Bristol Radical History and also an academic at University of the West of England, and probably a couple of others who I can't recall at this minute. But we were just chatting, and then it got into kind of the merchant venturers discussion. And I, as a former student of Colston Girls, just sort of chipped into the conversation and said, yeah, and because this was October, I said, yeah, and we're coming up to the annual commemoration at the cathedral because it's the first Friday of November. And then from there, it was an idea of, well, let's go down. And we told other people, and on the first Friday of November 2015, Bristol Radical History Group had produced a pamphlet with more facts about Edward Colston, and there was probably about 10 of us, including Marty Burgess, who was a member of Countering Colston and was also part of Bristol Music Trust, a trustee there, which ran the Colston Hall, or still does, Bristol Beacon. Obviously, she's gone on to be the first African heritage merchant venturer, but she was involved and other people. And we went along, and that was our first intervention, standing outside the cathedral and handing out pamphlets to the students who were very interested in what we had to say, who were completely oblivious to who they were celebrating, as I was when I was at school. I actually saw someone from my year group who was now a teacher at what was Colston Girls, now Montpellier High, and I got invited in as a former, what we call them, old girls. Once you've left, you're an old girl. So I was invited into the service, and I hadn't been in since leaving school in '98. So it was a very surreal experience. And yeah, it was quite interesting because the teachers kind of credited my activism with the fact that I'd gone and had a good education at Colston Girls. That was quite ironic, but yeah, that was our main thing. And from then it was a case of trying to get meetings with the dean at the time, the heads of the schools, and the Colston Hall, and just chipping away until finally it did start to cave.
What were the most important activities and achievements of Countering Colston during its life from 2015 onwards, if it's still ongoing? What did you most contribute to Countering Colston during this period?
I think our first real tangible win was, I would say, being totally instrumental in getting the Colston Hall to agree to change their name. And I don't think any of this could have happened without the fact that we had someone on the board there who was also encountering Colston, someone from Bristol University, Joanna Birch-Brown. Myself, I'd then become an elected councillor. And it was then, because of convention by their own standards, it was very difficult for the establishment to actually ignore us, because we had people in those positions. And then, I'd challenged at a cabinet meeting, not long after being elected, actually, a cabinet meeting, there was an item coming to discuss the redevelopment of the Colston Hall. And you have to ask a question related to the agenda. So I simply asked, if the council is going to give 10 million for redevelopment, can we discuss a name change? And also, why are we giving all that money to the Colston Hall in the name of culture, but yet places like Malcolm X Centre, Quimber Centre, Trinity Arts Centre, etc., they're not getting a penny? Can we look into that? I mean, it didn't go down well, but the chair of the Colston Hall at the time completely agreed, or at least in that meeting. Obviously probably wanted to say anything to get to 10 million, but that was a challenge there. And then they went on to confirm that they would change the name. So some institutions, from kind of a sense of not giving us the time of day or being Britishly polite enough to hold a meeting with us and listen, well, actually they did make local press, more national press, the original demo outside of the cathedral, because we were accused of accosting students and all this kind of stuff, all this rubbish. So it did also depend on what was the leadership in these places. That was important. And when that started to shift, then we saw more things shifting. But yeah, I would say the name change on the Colston Hall, and we have to thank artist Ros Martin, who would go out and chalk. That was her weapon of choice, to just pitch up outside these venues and start chalking things about slavery and enslavement and all of that to raise awareness. So we'd also been at St. Stephen's Church with the kind of annual sort of services of the different Colston related societies. We made ourselves a problem, really.
Now, you mentioned leadership. And you mentioned earlier that you were elected Lord Mayor of Bristol. In what ways were you able to harness the office, or did you witness, from the perspective of this office, the contestation of the statue?
I'm not sure if I did that much, to be honest, because I also had to mix and mingle with people who wouldn't understand it was a problem. I didn't experience any. When I became a councillor, and that was 2 years before becoming Lord Mayor, I said to the Green groups, I was a Green Party councillor, we all had to say what our aims were for the year ahead or whatever. And I said, as a member of Countering Colston, I said, my aim is to get a name change for the Colston Hall, or be part of that. And there was only one clear person who didn't think that was a good idea, but the rest of the group supported me. And they've always gone on to support all the actions, including things like trying to support the Colston 4 and all of that, and putting pressure on the administration. Before I came into office, I'd recently discovered that there were, because we were also, people like Mark Steeves were also cataloguing every single mention or thing to do with Colston, and we didn't know that there was a massive portrait of him in City Hall in the Lord Mayor's parlour. So when I was aware of that and was aware I was going to become Lord Mayor, I started to ask the officers, can we get it removed? And I honestly didn't have any resistance. So yeah, I think people were understanding how problematic he was. And then, of course, into the idea of this plaque, because of the rogue plaque that was appearing, people developing a project to actually make an alternative plaque to stick on the statue. But as we know, that was made and then scrapped.
Now, you mentioned your participation in a campaign to support the Colston 4, and did you say against the administration, or what was your participation in that campaign to support the Colston 4?
My personal involvement was that I agreed to write a statement of how I found the statue offensive and how, you know, it shouldn't have got to that point. Something should have been done. And then I was called in to be a witness in the trial, and that was more about my time at my school, and how I wasn't really listened to or wasn't educated or anything about who Colston was really. So yeah, I'd say that's my main involvement. But other people were really campaigning, some members of Countering Colston, and I think they turned into, or were part of something called Glad Colston's Gone, to support as much as they could with money for legal fees and etc., so that the Colston 4 wouldn't go down.
Now, what has been the role of the council in this? For instance, what, to your knowledge, is the We Are Bristol History Commission, and what do you know of its report?
The History Commission was set up quite reactionarily to that was the main action really by the council, and the Mayor's office to set up this History Commission, which again, a lot of grumbles from other people about who was on it, how it was set up, and all of the rest of it. But I would say that the consultation that they did was very good, that was sort of done for the City Council. And I think the report is also very useful. So, I mean, that whilst some of the participants to the consultation survey would have been from outside of Bristol, and of course it's very high profile, it was the most engaged with council consultation ever. So I see that as being quite a success actually, and I think how it was designed, and you know, the visuals of it, I think were good. And I also do support staff members, curators, people at the museums for putting the statue back on display, etc. I know the History Commission and Sean Sobers were also involved in that, but I think like a lot of institutions, they're on a journey. They've had to learn very fast, very quickly, and I hope that it's there's been a chance for proper learning and supported learning, because people are at different stages of their understanding. So we can be impatient. I'm quite impatient sometimes, but I think there has to be not a safe space, but a space for people to unintentionally get it wrong and be corrected as to how to get it right, or bring in people who can help them get it right.
You mentioned a survey that was conducted by the council and reported on by the We Are Bristol History Commission. What contribution did you make to that survey, or did people whom in your circle make to that survey?
I think I don't recall making any contribution to the survey other than filling it out, but I do know that early Countering Colston member who did end up leaving, Jo Birch-Brown, was co-chair of the History Commission, so she was quite involved in that whole process, I believe.
And what is the Legacy Steering Group, and what is its relationship to or with the We Are Bristol History Commission? And what is Project Truth, and what's the relationship between Project Truth and the final report of the We Are Bristol History Commission?
In some ways, I think whilst they were both separate, and of course the Legacy Steering Group, or Bristol Legacy Group it's now called, predated this because it was conceived and got off the ground around 2017. 2017, I think that's right. Yeah, 2017, pulled together by Deputy Mayor Ashley Craig, as you know. And there has been, times when the chair has come to the meetings. I've been a part of it since it started. There have been times when I think it's fair to say the chair of the History Commission did come back and report to us quite regularly, actually. So I should say we did have an oversight and a view of what was going on before it was necessarily public. So they were keeping us updated. After a sort of lapse of action, I would say, we've kind of reignited the Legacy Group. Project Truth was on the main thing we'd achieved since forming, which was a consultation with African heritage communities about how Bristol should commemorate, or what should we do in terms of the legacies of African enslavement. And we're working through that. And I know that off the top of my head, I can't see whether Project Truth informed the survey as such, but they were definitely aware of it. Definitely something they took fairly seriously, the History Commission. And yeah, we'd hoped to work more closely together as partners, because again, the History Commission though was set up quite swiftly as a way of the city or the mayor's office looking to be doing something, and it was apparently always going to look at other factors of Bristol history. But actually, I've been told more recently by a member of staff of the mayor's office, who is part of the partnerships on the Legacy Group, that the commission will be winding down, and they're not going to be doing anything else. So we won't really be interacting with them, because they probably won't exist.
What was the methodology? What was your relationship with Project Truth? What was the methodology that was followed in consulting African communities? And what are the chief learnings from that consultation?
Yeah, I was the lead consultant and researcher, and I was the lead person who wrote the report with support from Black Southwest Network. You'll find the report on their website, and it's kind of commissioned by the City Council, but it would appear in it and sort of stand as their report in some ways. And the methodology, well, the sort of rationale behind it was to acknowledge that African heritage communities are a diverse group of communities and have different levels of understanding about the history of enslavement. So part of it was actually, how can we bring people along with us? How can we educate and inform? So part of the methodology was about education and information. So we utilised local radio. So we had a weekly radio show running for a couple of months, which I produced and presented as a way of letting people know what was going on. There was your sort of standard survey, and it did take quite some time to compile the right kind of questions. Some quantitative, a lot of qualitative. We had several different focus groups and a number of sort of public meetings where we would have presentations and then discussions. So out of that, we actually came out with many recommendations. I think off the top of my head, it's got to be over 40 recommendations, but then they were grouped into different areas. So you would things that you would expect: health, education, wealth creation. Some of it crossed over slightly with the reparations motion that was passed. At the moment, it's African Connections Consortium who are doing more of the work on the ground with communities in terms of sort of getting a reparations plan going. But what has emerged, which sort of comes out of a key recommendation, which is a Pan-African Centre of Excellence, and which is distinct from any kind of museum idea. So at the moment, there's a concept now of the Zenzele village, which is a kind of African-centred, African-led provisioned complex that could be in or just outside of Bristol. So that is in train, as is the main one that is being carried forward at the moment is the memorialisation recommendation. So those things have been taken on board, and I'm co-chairing the memorialisation task group, and that formed about a month or two ago, where we've taken what was from Project Truth. We're also taking some of the testimonials that happened at an event led by Gary Young a couple of months ago called Memorialising the Future. So that's a very tangible thing. In some ways, although it hasn't been that straightforward, isn't that straightforward, perhaps one of the more easier to-dos out of the list of recommendations from Project Truth.
Now, you mentioned the setting up of an organization or an institution or a place that is not a museum. Could you tell me a bit more about the way in which you conceive of what you're building or what you intend to build as something other than a museum? And second, to what extent did this consultation of African communities or your recommendations make any mention whatsoever of the statue of Colston?
Okay, I would say that none of our questions mentions the Colston statue, because again, some of this work was in train before the statue was actually toppled. So of course it would probably be people's perception that, oh well, the statue's toppled and now we're having a consultation, but it wasn't actually planned that way. It doesn't mention it, but well, I say it doesn't mention it. It probably does in passing in some of the chapters in the report, but the consultation didn't mention it specifically. So people would have responded about it in their answers, but yeah, we didn't lead with that because I think some members, particularly of the group, never wanted to be distracted or use that as an anchor point.
Why do you think some of the members didn't want to use the statue of Colston as an anchor point? Or why do you think they might have thought it a distraction?
Because they see things as being much bigger than Colston, and I guess, I mean, I don't know, I felt that I find it hard to find anyone who would say, oh, it shouldn't have been done like, well, some people did say that actually, but I think they, probably a mixture of things, but, you know, coming from a Pan-African perspective, I don't think they really wanted to acknowledge it too much. And that sounds a stupid thing to say. I can't really articulate it well, but not a kind of, I'm sure they're happy that it did happen, but there's a bit of tinge of, I can't say jealousy, but I can't quite put my finger on why they may not celebrate it as much as someone like myself would. And they don't want the focus just to be on the statue, because things were happening before, things have always been happening. Yeah, so I'm not best placed to really answer that.
And what is the distinction between a Pan-African Centre of Excellence and a museum? Okay,
so the Project Truth did conclude that many people thought that everyone needed to be more educated, that the story needed to be a holistic one that could also, where possible, empower particularly African heritage people in the story and have them lead the narrative. The museum, whilst it would be from an African-centred lens, if you like, or that would be the ambition, alongside, you know, cold hard facts here and there, I guess, that is for everyone. It's for the city. It's for everyone to come and learn and understand more from whatever background you are. Whereas the Pan-African Centre of Excellence it has been framed as something for African heritage people on their own terms, for their own needs, to be self-reliant, but it is also a place where non-African heritage people can come as students, but they have to acknowledge that they are there in the role as students. So it's about self-reliance. It's not, I don't see it, or I don't want to see it so much as segregation, but I guess there's an aspect of that. It's saying, actually, we're always trying to make the best out of very bad situations, institutions that were definitely never designed for us, and it's good to try and change them, but actually let's pour our energy in building something for ourselves with help from others and definitely resources from others, and let's try to you know, learn how to build our own homes, learn how to live sufficiently, train up youngsters doing X, Y, and Z, have our own schools, have our own university. So all of these aspects.
You mention a survey or a consultation that you conducted of African communities or African descended communities. And you mentioned a long history. You began at the beginning of this interview speaking about a long history of African contributions to the contestation of the statue of Edward Colston. And although we haven't touched upon it, the statue of Edward Colston was toppled during a Black Lives Matter protest in 2020.
Yeah.
Reflecting upon each of these three, and maybe there are others, sources of Black voices raised over the years, to what extent, in your opinion, from your perspective, to what extent have these Black voices been listened to?
To no extent. To zero extent, to be honest. We've just been broken records for decades, centuries. I don't think we've been listened to at all. I think only now, since the statue has toppled, that maybe there's an element of listening, but it's still kind of to certain people, if you like. Yeah, I mean, as I said, I don't think Countering Colston would have been as effective if we weren't in some of us in civic roles. And yeah, I feel now there is an opportunity for change, but yeah, I don't think I mean, even thinking back to, again, going back to school, and when I tried to ask questions about Colston to my headmistress, who was also my English literature A-level tutor, in the class with other students who were all of European heritage, when I tried to ask her about what was going on, why did I see people who looked like me, African Caribbean people, or I would have said black people then, on the TV talking about bringing the statue down? Why? Who's Colston? And you know, the denial and the actual words used of, oh, these are just stupid uneducated people. And I think that has been the narrative until quite recently, really, about black people and our activism.
Lord Mayor Cleo Lake, thank you for sharing with us your perspective on the contestation of the statue of Edward Colston.
You're welcome. I would just say that a statue that is also, that I have looked at more, is the William III, which is in Queen Square, the centre of Queen Square. And I will just give a tip that actually we're hoping, as the memorialisation task group, that will be replaced by a memorialisation, that whole area from the plinth down towards Queen Square and Queen Charlotte Street will become an avenue of remembrance. So, you know, we are still, I think it'll be a great statement to be, you know, removing the city council to remove William III, not to have him toppled, but to have him removed and replaced.
And given the centrality of Queen Square in Bristol's enslaving history, that would seem a most appropriate move.
It would. I mean, a council officer who's kind of working with us was really pushing for Cascade Steps, which is the kind of where the water flows down steps near before you get to the watershed, where you go to the watershed or round to the Onofini side. And actually looking there, it's very busy, you know, lots going on, a bike lane, and you just walk from there to Queen Square. You've got all the trees, you've got a calm, you've got a space to reflect. So yeah, we're pushing for that, definitely.
I wish you very good luck. Thank you very much, Cleo.
You're welcome. Take care.
Stop the recording now.